are these people?
Tonight's first article, The Subtleties of Anti-Russia Leftist Rhetoric, from Off Guardian, which is an outstanding publication that initially I heard about, I think, through Whitney Webb, maybe through some other, I know Steve from Slow News Day reads them regularly. But this was a really spicy article, and I agreed with it quite a bit, and I wanted everyone to take a look because it does take a shot at some of the sacred cows on the left and in the space. All right, so again, while the so-called liberal and conservative corporate mainstream media, who are all stenographers for the intel agencies, pour forth the most blatant propaganda about Russia and Ukraine that is so conspicuous that it's even comedic if it weren't so dangerous, self-depicted cognoscenti is also ingests subtler messages, often from the alternative media. I read that first paragraph. I was like, I love what I'm reading already. This guy's great. All right. Oh, as a woman, this writer is great. Tripped up there. I know, and who knows my so-called sociological analyses of propaganda. Contacted me to tell me there was an excellent article about the war in Ukraine at The Intercept. Oh boy, an online publication funded by billionaire Pierre Omidyar, as we know, who she's long considered an example of much deceptive reporting wherein truth is mixed with falsehoods to convey a liberal narrative that fundamentally supports the ruling elites while seeming to oppose them. Right, fierce adversarial journalism, I seem to recall, was the phrase to describe The Intercept. So this, of course, is nothing new, since the MO of all corporate media in their own ideological and disingenuous ways, as all the ones that we know and love for a very long time. Right, so out of respect for her judgment as a friend of hers, knowing how deeply she feels about suffering people, she reads the article, and it's written by Alice Speary, and it's an ambiguous title. The left in Europe confronts NATO's resurgence after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Until I saw the subtle headline, the subtitle, that begins with the words, Russia's brutal invasion complicates, but I read on. By the fourth paragraph, it became clear where this article was going. Speary writes that in Ukraine, by contrast with Iraq, it was Russia that had staged an illegal, unprovoked invasion, and U.S.-led support to Ukraine was understood by many as crucial to stave off even worse atrocities than those the Russian military had already committed, which was her episode. What?
No. Effing F?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah. While ostensibly about European anti-war and anti-NATO activists caught on the horns of dilemma, this piece goes on to assert that although U.S. and NATO was guilty of wrongful expansion over many years, Russia's been an aggressor in Ukraine and Georgia and is guilty of terrible war crimes, etc. But there's not
the fuck.
Thank you, Jimmy. Not a word about the U.S. engineered coup in 2014, CIA and Pentagon-backed mercenaries in Ukraine, or for its support for the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion. I laughed my ass off on that one. And Ukraine's years of attacks on the Donbass where many thousands have been killed. 14,000, I believe, was the most recent number I had heard. It's assumed that these actions are not criminal or provocative, and who could not see that one coming? And that joke just never gets old. So then there's this, her emphasis.
What do you mean?
Right.
That joke.
The uncertain response. This is a quote from The Intercept. The uncertain response of Europe's peace activists is both a reflection of a brutal, unprovoked invasion that stunned the world of an anti-war movement that has grown smaller and more marginalized over the years. The left in both Europe and the U.S. have struggled to respond to a wave of support for Ukraine that is at cross purposes with a decades-long effort to untangle Europe from a U.S.-led military alliance. In other words, the article, couched in anti-war rhetoric, was anti-Russia propaganda, which we already knew, because Russia bad, according to The Intercept. They're the ones that buried the Hunter Biden story with Glenn Greenwald. So, when I told my friend my analysis, she refused to discuss it, got angry with me, and as if, therefore, I were a proponent of war, I found this to be a common response. And, yeah.
Yep.
So this gets her thinking about why so often people miss the untruths lying within articles that are in many parts truthful and accurate. I notice this constantly, right? Little seeds slipped in as if no one will notice. They work their magic nearly unconsciously. If you do notice them, for they are often imperceptible. Again, this is what this about manufacturing consent. And that's really what we wanted to talk about tonight was the ways that the consent is manufactured. This is you got to stick with us for a little bit. This article is going to take a little bit, but stick with us. I think this is you're gonna like this. But again, they have their effects, right?
Stay right there.
Right, and they're cumulative, and they're far more powerful over time than blatant statements. And this is all pretty obvious stuff, but it's making an argument with what we would call today's modern day shitlib, an intercept reader, okay, a TYT fan. This is the power of successful propaganda, whether purposeful or not. It works particularly well on intellectual and highly schooled people, right? Because it makes them feel smart. And here we go with the sacred cows. For example, in a printed interview recently, Noam Chomsky, after being introduced as a modern-day Galileo, Newton, and Descartes rolled into one, he talks about propaganda, its history, Edward Bernays, Walter Lippmann, etc. What he says is historically accurate and informative for anyone not knowing this history. He speaks wisely of U.S. media propaganda concerning its unprovoked war against Iraq, and he accurately calls the war in Ukraine provoked. And then, concerning the war in Ukraine, he drops this startling statement. Here we go, Noam, manufacturing consent. I don't think there are significant lies in war reporting. Oh my God. The U.S. media are generally doing a highly creditable job in reporting Russian crimes in Ukraine. That's valuable, just as it's valuable that international investigations are underway in preparation for possible war crimes trials. Wait, what? In the blink of an eye, Chomsky says something so incredibly untrue, unless one thinks of him as a modern-day Galileo, which many do. It may pass as true, and you'll smoothly move on to the next paragraph, yet it's a statement so false as to be laughable. The media propaganda concerning events in Ukraine we know have been so blatantly false and ridiculous that a careful reader will stop suddenly and think, did he just say that? Yeah, he did. So now he views the media, such as New York Times, until that he's correctly castigated for propagandizing the U.S. in Iraq and East Timor, for example, to use two examples, doing a highly creditable job reporting Russian crimes in Ukraine, as if suddenly they're no longer spokespeople for the CIA and U.S. disinformation. Jesus Christ. Right. And he says this while we're in the midst of the greatest propaganda blitz since World War I, with its censorship, disinformation governance board, platforming of dissidents, etc., that border on a parody of 1984. Even slicker is his casual assertion that the media are doing a good job reporting Russia's war crimes after he's earlier has said this about propaganda. So it continues, particularly in the more free societies where the means of state violence have been constrained by popular activism, it is of great importance to devise methods of manufacturing consent and to ensure that they are internalized, becoming as invisible as the air we breathe, particularly in articulate, educated circles. Imposing war myths is a regular feature of these enterprises. Again, this is Noam Chomsky. This is simply masterful. Explain what propaganda is at its best and how you oppose it, then drop a soupçon of it into your analysis. Now, I don't even know. Do you know that word? I don't speak French. I know it's French.
Soupçon?
Yes.
Soupçon. That's like a little bigger than a pinch.
Okay. And while he's at it, he makes sure to praise Chris Hedges, one of his followers.
I know what it's a BAM. It's Emerald BAM. That's
it's an Emerald BAM. I got you. It's a geez, a little toss in. Nice. So Chris Hedges is one of Chomsky's disciples, who himself has recently written an article, "The Age of Self-Delusion," that also contains valid points appealing to those sick of wars, but which also contains the following words. Quote, Putin's revanchism is matched by our own. The disorganization, ineptitude, and low morale of the Russian army conscripts, along with the repeated intelligence failures by the Russian high command, apparently convinced Russia would roll over Ukraine in a few days, exposes the lie that Russia is a global menace. Quote, the Russian bear has effectively defanged itself, historian Andrew Basovich writes. But this is not a truth war makers impart on the public to the public. Russia must be inflated to become a global menace. despite 9 weeks of humiliating military failures. Wait, what? Russia's revanchism? Where? Revanchism, and what lost territory has the U.S. ever waged war to recover?
Yeah.
On top of the fact that humiliating military failures, where? They've been advancing
Right.
Iraq, Syria, Cuba, Vietnam, Yugoslavia, etc. The U.S.'s history is a history not of revanchism, but of imperial conquest, of seizing or controlling territory.
A lot of those we lost.
Yeah, while Russia's war in Ukraine is clearly an act of self-defense after years of U.S., NATO, Ukraine provocations and threats, which Hedges recognizes. But 9 weeks of humiliating military failures? Yeah, when they control a large section of eastern and southern Ukraine, including Donbass? But his false message is subtly woven, like Chomsky's, into sentences that are true. And here's another one. But this is not a truth the war makers impart to the public. No, it is exactly what the media spokespeople for the war makers, i.e. the New York Times, by the way, Hedges' former employer, which he never fails to mention, and whom he covered the Clinton administration's savage destruction of Yugoslavia. CNN, Fox News, the Washington Post, the New York Post, etc., import to the public every day for their masters. Now, I believe this writer is not American, and I don't think that matters. Chris Hedges did work for RT for many years, so he does have a unique perspective. And he worked for the New York Times, and I don't think he hides that fact, and I think it's pretty well known that he was an editor at the New York Times. But headlines that read how Russia, while allegedly committing daily war crimes, is failing in its war, aims that the mythic hero Zelensky is leading Ukrainians to victory. Words to the effect that the Russian bear has effectively defanged itself, presented as fact, which is crazy. Yes, they do inflate the Russian monster myth, only then to puncture it with the myth of the Samson defeating Goliath. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But being in the business of mind games, too much consistency leads to clarity and gives the game away. One can expect them to scramble their messages on an ongoing basis to serve the U.S. agenda in Ukraine and further NATO expansion in the undeclared war with Russia, for which the Ukrainian people will be sacrificed. And Orwell called it doublethink. And there's a whole paragraph from Orwell that I didn't include. Oh, actually, I did, because I thought it was actually pretty important to include it, because I was going to skip it. And
here's like in the second chapter.
Right, it talks about INCSOC, right? So doublethink, which lies at the very heart of INCSOC, since the essential act of the party is to use conspicuous deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty. God, it's so like, wow.
Yep.
It's like poetry. To tell deliberate lies.
INCSOC is their like shortened language, right?
That is
like that, right?
I thought it was like kind of like the central corporate governmental, they're the ruling party that kind of,
it might be
the directive of it, right? To tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them, to forget any fact that has become inconvenient, and then when it becomes necessary again, to draw it back from oblivion for just so long as it's needed, to then deny its existence, the existence of objective reality, and all the while to take account of the reality one denies. All this is indispensably necessary, with the lie always one step ahead of the truth. Revealing and concealing and interjecting, inoculating shots of untruths that will only get cursory attention from the readers. The writers mentioned here and others have great appeal for the left intelligentsia. Yes, they do. For the people who basically worship those they've imbued with infallibility and genius, it's very hard to read all sentences carefully and smell a skunk. The subterfuge is often very adroit, and appeals to the reader's sense of outrage at what's happened in the past, e.g. the George W. Bush administration's lies about WMD in Iraq. Chomsky, of course, is the leader of the pack, and here's where I think people are going to start to get upset. And I love that Off Guardian is at least taking shots and asking the questions and making the hard challenges, and whether I agree with it or not is one thing. I just thought it was really important to showcase and spotlight this. Well, Nomi, of course, again, is the leader of the pack, and his followers are legion, including Hedges. Now, again, I'm a big Hedges fan, so this is opening my eyes. So, for decades, they've been either avoiding or supporting the official versions of the assassinations of JFK and RFK, the attacks of September 11th that led directly to the war on terror and so many wars of aggression, and the recent COVID-19 propaganda with its devastating lockdowns and crackdowns on civil liberties. They're far from historical amnesiacs, of course, but obviously consider these foundational events of no importance, for otherwise they would have addressed them. Again, I disagree with that statement, that sentence, but again, this is what the writer has to say. If you expect them to explain, you'll be waiting a long time. And I don't disagree with that. I think they don't have answers, and they don't necessarily need to answer for all of it, everything, but these are tough questions and tough things to deal with. But here's what they're talking about. So in a recent article by Christian Parenti, How the Organized Left Got COVID Wrong, Learned to Love Lockdowns and Lost Its Mind, an autopsy, which I believe was published in the Gray Zone. It's like a 15-page article. I mean, just long. It's like a book. But Christian Parenti, which I think this is an excellent article. I know that Max Blumenthal went on Jimmy Dore and talked about it. Quote, almost the entire left intelligentsia has remained physically stuck in March 2020. Its members have applauded the new biosecurity repression and calumniated as liars, grifters, and fascists any and all who dissented. Okay, typically they did so without even engaging evidence and while shirking public debate. Among the most visible in this has been Noam Chomsky, the self-described anarcho-syndicalist who called for the unvaccinated to remove themselves from society and suggested they should be allowed to go hungry if they refuse to submit. Parenti's critique of the left's response, not just Chomsky's and Hedges, to COVID, also applies to those foundational events mentioned above, which raises deeper questions about the CIA and NSA's penetration of the media in general, a subject beyond the scope of this analysis, which we've talked about ad nauseum. For those like the liberal woman who referred her to the Intercept article, who would no doubt say of what I've written here, why are you picking on leftists? Her reply is quite simple. The right-wing and neocons are obvious in their pernicious agendas. Nothing's really hidden, therefore they can and should be opposed. But many leftists serve two masters and are far subtler. Ostensibly on the side of regular people and opposed to imperialism and the predations of the elites at home and abroad, they're often tricksters of beguiling rhetoric that their followers miss. Rhetoric that indirectly fuels the wars they say they oppose. Smelling skunks is not as obvious as it may seem. Being nocturnal, they come forth when most are sleeping.
Reminds me of another quote. Do you remember which one that one is? You know, the moderate liberal. That guy. You know.
I might have heard his voice once or twice in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Yep.
But support Off Guardian. Please do. And edwardcurtin.com. He's writing a new book. Wait, Edward Curtin? I guess so. That's interesting. But that was a really interesting article, taking shots at Chomsky, taking shots at Hedges, saying that they're also manufacturing consent, which interesting. Got to pay attention. Look, no sacred cows in this business, unfortunately. And look, we've heard stuff about Nomi for quite a while. I would say Steve and Whitney and some others have been pretty vocal about Nomi. Hedges to a lesser degree. I think Hedges certainly does have a workers' mindset and message. However, the challenges about not acknowledging 9/11 and the two assassinations is a valid point. So I love stuff that makes me think. Do I agree with the take on Hedges? I'm not sure if I agree with the take on Hedges. I think he discloses plenty.
Hedges is lumped in a little.
I think he discloses plenty that he worked at the New York Times. I think that his support of the Palestinian people in the face of of an entire machine that would like him to not talk about it, thank you very much, is admirable.
I mean, it was like the JFK stuff. Most people haven't even, like, they completely write it off, right? Like, they haven't even ever looked at it.
Well, everybody has their flaws, I would say, and their blind spots.
Right.
I would. And again, he worked at the New York Times, so therefore he has more access.
The bit about that whole story is the bullet, the pristine bullet found at the like that was the bullet. The fact that it's pristine. I don't know if you ever shot bone. Things don't look that pretty on the other side.
Yes, they certainly don't. Well, at least in the movie, it looked that way. I'm not sure exactly how it looked on the stretcher because it didn't make the chain of evidence, the chain of custody. They broke chain of custody.
There's pictures. It's like it's been fired into it's like a perfect bullet. Right? It's like got the pictures with the ruler right next to it. In the evidence thing.
Yes, it is in the evidence thing. I'm just gonna post in Ghost. I do want to post the Rock Finland.
Looking at that the most, right?
I believe that he was looking at that quite a bit. Okay,
live. Talked about it with Rogan not that long ago.
Yes, he did talk about it with Rogan. I believe that was more than 3.5 hours, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was crazy.
And everybody talked about his JFK. What is it? 30 years. The 30-year anniversary of the release of the movie that he did this year, and revisiting that whole thing. Okay, so.